Along this afternoon, Minister. This marks our last evidence session in our inquiry into the different claimant experience of the work programme. So you're very welcome this afternoon. If you can introduce yourself and your official for the record, that would be great.
Yes, I'm Mark Hope, I'm the Minister for Employment. I have with me Julia Sweeney, who's the Interim Director responsible for contracted services, which includes the work programme.
Well, thanks very much. My members are still arriving. Minimum performance levels. I wonder how you respond to Sean Williams of G4S, who told us that the real lesson to draw from the Prime's failure to meet the Year 1 minimum performance levels was that they themselves were completely inadequate for the task.
Well, I mean, I think that we set out very clearly when the programme went out for tender the level of performance we expected in the throughout the life of the contract. And I think it's absolutely right that we're ambitious for the programme. We should set some demanding goals for Primes to deliver. I think there are a number of issues why Primes fell short of the minimum performance levels in the first year. I think that the challenge around mobilisation of their supply chains were much greater, I think, than they anticipated. The economic climate wasn't as strong as they'd hoped for. So, they make no apology for the targets we set. I think that they set the right objectives for the programme, but I think there's some challenge around delivering those.
So you don't take any responsibility that actually you just got the levels wrong?
Well, the levels are the ones that were being set. There was quite a long process that took place prior to the contract going out, setting those levels. I think there are some. I think there's one area, Damon, where I might just highlight an issue in terms of where the MPL was set. And that was for payment group 6 for ESA claimants, where actually this is a relatively new programs, a relatively new benefit with very little past experience on how employment programs work for these claimants. So I think there is a challenge about the setting of the MPL for that payment group. But I think that there was an extensive program, process of negotiation and discussion between ourselves, the Treasury and Cabinet Office, about what that MPL should be. And the Primes all knew that MPL when they signed up.
But most of the claimants were straightforward GSA. In fact, the problem was that they were mostly GSA. There were very few of the other categories. And are you not, as a government, making it incredibly difficult for the Primes, or setting them up to fail, if you like? Because if they don't hit their minimum performance targets in Year 1, they're unlikely to meet them in Year 2, or it's going to get increasingly difficult in Year 2, because they're always going to be a moving target for them.
Well, and I think that we haven't set them up to fail. We have set them up to have some difficult targets to meet. I think that's important. This is a scheme to get people into work, and I don't think we should make it easy for Primes to hit those MPL. I'm not sure I agree with your comment about making it harder to hit in Year 2, and obviously we're going to publish data on performance at the end of May, so I don't want to sort of say anything that prejudges that data. But I think what we saw, particularly in the figures that URSA produced at the end of September, to the end of September last year, showing 200,000 job starts, I think that demonstrates there's performance in the pipeline. And we're
going to be coming exactly to that question, and I'm not going to take my colleagues because I know that that's the question, and we know we are coming on to those ERSA figures in just some time.
But so I think that there's plenty of time to achieve 6 months job outcome in a 2-year period, and that's why we thought it was important or URSA felt it was important to publish that job start data to give a sense of how many jobs had been started. To demonstrate there were people in that pipeline, and that you could achieve good performance in Year 2 off the back of that.
Great.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. If job outcome performance continues to fail to meet the contractual arrangements and the minimum performance levels, at what point are you able to take action against underperforming Primes, and what form would that action take?
Well, there's a range of measures we can take, Mr. Evans, and I made it very clear when we published the data in November that we was going to take action against underperformance. We wrote to 5 Primes in 7 areas to highlight the need for improvement plans. My team, and Julia leads this, do engage very closely with primes on performance through frequency ranging from daily through to monthly meetings with them, depending on how some of the issues that primes have. So we've started that engagement. I've spoken to a number of primes, highlighting the need for them to raise their game, so that they need to achieve the MPLs, demonstrating, proving we're not going to let them off. It's trying to hit those MPLs. The next sort of lever that we have is a market share shift. So where there is a gap in ACPA between primes that's more than 3%, we can move market share from one prime to another, and we can move 5% of their market share from the underperforming prime to a stronger performing prime, and we intend to use that mechanism. But the final sanction is actually we can remove a contract from a prime. We can decide actually not making sufficient progress, or there's no sign of them making sufficient progress to hit those MPLs, and as a last resort we can move that contract away from them. If we need to do that as department, we will do it.
On both those issues, Graham, if I can jump in there, because I understand the concept and actually support the concept, because then obviously we're going to be rewarding the better performing prime. So on the surface it looks absolutely sensible. The couple of things that come up though from the expert witnesses that I'd be really interested on how you would respond is that, let's say in a few months' time you've got two primes in an area, one's clearly outperforming the other, so you do want to shift it. My first question would be what management systems are in place to ensure that the job seekers that are with the poorer performing prime don't actually lose out, because clearly that needs to be taken into account. And secondly, is it really a realistic option for the DWP to terminate a prime contract? So the first thing, how do you manage the worst performing primes for those job seekers who are with them? And secondly, are you really serious about possibly terminating a contract?
Let me assure the committee and anyone who is interested in this, I am absolutely serious about this. I don't think it's acceptable for underperformance to continue. I think we're letting down the unemployed if we do so. I think it's wrong for the taxpayer to allow this underperformance to continue, because effectively we'll be paying benefit for longer. So it is unacceptable for a poor performance to continue, and we will not hesitate to use contractual powers at our disposal to penalise poor performance. Now, on the point about the market share shift, this would be for new referrals going to a prime. It won't affect the referrals that have already been made to them. And what's quite interesting, and I talked to a number of primes who've used this already with their subcontractors. And what you tend to see is this: you do see a reward for better performing subcontractors, but what you also see, which I think is quite interesting, is that it means that there's a lighter caseload for the underperforming contractor. And you can, and I hope what that would mean is there'll be an increase in resources on those people who have attached to that subcontractor, which would then lead to an improvement in outcomes. And that's certainly been the experience of one or two primes I've spoken to who've done their own market share shift within their supply chain.
And so would it be a fair statement to say, obviously, backing up what you've just told us, that yes, the department's crystal clear that it will use that sanction if it chooses to and if it has to, but secondly, could I, if say I'm one of the primes that's performing worse, I lose 15% perhaps of job seekers shifted to a better performing prime, and you're crystal clear that you're prepared to do that, but equally then if I improve as a poorer performing prime and actually demonstrate that I've sort of clawed my way back and I'm getting more and more job seekers into work, and then potentially in a year's time or so I might actually get rewarded for that good performance. So is the DWP keeping that level of intelligent flexibility within the process?
It is, and just to be clear, the maximum transfer is 5%.
5%, sorry.
But I think you have to be fair, I think, about this, and to say to those providers who actually raise their game that the market shift can be reversed. So I think that's absolutely right. We can't have we've got to have some incentives in the system.
Okay, just one last thing.
I think, sorry, there's one point I just want to raise that just goes back to Dame Ann's question about MPLs, and there is one issue Prime's raises in the context of MPLs. Because the MPL is based on this year's outcomes and this year's referrals, a beneficiary of market share shift would see a slight dip in net performance potentially, because their number of referrals has gone up, whereas a prime that's lost market share would see a slight improvement in their MPL, because you've got fewer people flowing onto your programme. We've still got the people who refer to the previous years who can still claim job outcomes from there. So there's a sort of a nuance or a subtlety in the MPLs on market share shift that we just need to bear in mind.
Okay, thank you. And then let's just go back finally to the potential of termination, that someone or a prime just has not stepped up to the plate. You've made it crystal clear the DWP is prepared to take the final sanction. Are you confident that if you have to do that, that the DWP will have the systems in place that could then cope with maybe the 5, 10, 15,000 job seekers who are with the failing prime? So I appreciate the strength of statement that if necessary you will pull contracts, but I would want to be satisfied that if that does happen, those people are properly accommodated and dealt with, and I want to be satisfied that DWP has that plan in the locker if it ever needs to be implemented.
What we've done is we've looked at this scenario, and to be right, you'd expect us to have done so. Our expectation would be that a new contract would move in and become the prime for that area, and effectively take up that workload, rather than necessarily coming in-house, although that's a fallback option. But my expectation would be that a new prime comes in.
Thank you, Chair.
Debbie.
You mentioned that you would consider converting one prime to another. Can I ask what the circumstances would be? You've mentioned the 3%. 3%, so there are already, thinking my own area, where there is a difference between the primes of at least that. So bearing in mind that today we had figures where there was an increase of 92% of people over 25 who were on JSA for over 2 years in the last year, an increase of 92%, Minister. At what stage will you actually take those sanctions?
But also, Ms Abrahams, you should look at the other figures in today's labour market stats release that show that long-term unemployment fell this month.
Not in my constituency.
But I'm just saying that overall long-term unemployment fell this month, and that's the second month running. And we are seeing people on the work programme get work.
It's nearly doubled in a year.
But the point I'm making is, if you look at long-term unemployment, it's actually fallen this month. Now, this is not a session on long-term unemployment, but I'm very clear, and that's why I set very, very ambitious goals for primes. That's why I make no apology for the MPL targets that we've set, that we want primes to deliver the right outcomes. And the difference is between this programme and previous programmes is in before, most of the money came regardless of whether or not you got an outcome, whether or not you got somebody into work for more than 6 months. And so this scheme is actually designed to deliver the right outcomes for people who are unemployed, the right outcomes from taxpayers for paying by results, and the right outcome primes. Primes only get paid if they are successful. So all the incentives are in there to get the right outcome. It's a much better scheme design than the previous schemes who paid people regardless of whether or not they got good outcomes or not.
And that's what this inquiry is about.
Could I just ask a question on the reduction in long-term unemployment? Do you have the divisions of which category of people are in that reduction?
It's all set out in the Labour Force survey.
What does that mean?
Well, there's a weekly set of pile of data.
Yes, but your programme actually defines people into various benefit groups.
Yes, so
and there is a pricing structure for those. And you've just said to us that long-term unemployment, people unemployed for more than 2 years, has fallen. And I'm asking you, do you have the stats which tell us which category of people are in that fall in unemployment?
Well, Mr. Jackson, what you'll see in the figures, it shows the number of people in long-term employment defined by the ILO Labour Force survey, and also
Students.
number of people in the labour force survey.
Which includes students.
Well, it depends. You can break down the categories by age, by education, type, whether in employment or not. It also has the job seekers allowance claim account in there as well.
Can I just when would you take any action in terms of market share shift? What stage into the contracts? We're over 18 months, getting on for 2 years of the contract. When would you make that decision?
The market share shift, we've got to allow providers to demonstrate what they're capable of doing. This is someone was on the programme for 2 years. We will look at the performance of providers over a 2-year period. And then if there are...
but you don't get the data, your 2-year data, till another 6 months further down the line. So would it be really looking at 2.5 years into, from the beginning of the work programme before you actually, take any of these decisions?
No, I'd expect...
Because you're going to have, as I say, that time lag in the data.
Yes, no, absolutely. And we have management information which the department uses to help manage these contracts. But I would expect to see market share shift to have completed no later than the end of this year.
In the end of this year, okay.
It's about one of the reasons for randomly allocating people was to be able to assess which is doing better. Is that information going to be available soon? Because quite a lot of individuals find that random allocation quite difficult, and I think when the Permanent Secretary was here a few months ago, suggested that might be looked at again.
Well, it's certainly the model we're going to use for this programme, and I think it's the right approach. It's interesting. I visited Australia last month to look at how they run their equivalent of the work programme. There's an element of choice by claimants, but my understanding is that most of them actually are allocated by random. Allocated randomly, claimants don't express a choice as to which provider they will go through.
I appreciate that, but in a few cases people have asked, they've had strong reasons for doing so, and I had a case a few months ago where somebody was sanctioned for 6 months because of that situation, and I think the Permanent Secretary did suggest, when I asked about that it might be looked at again.
It might be, but I don't envisage that would be quite a significant contractual change, and I think it would require some systems changes to do that.
In reply to Stephen, you give the example of the provider who might lose the market share because they're underperforming, and that might improve their performance. But for some, isn't there the bigger risk, or actually the bigger risk will be that it actually threatens their financial viability, particularly as from April 2014 there won't be any attachment fees.
Well, and I think that's exactly why, Damon, we are very focused, and they are focused on driving up outcomes as high as possible, as quickly as possible, because actually their financial viability is under threat if they don't perform well. And they recognise that risk that's there.
What assessment, or what risk assessment have you carried out with regard to the viability of some of the providers when these attachment fees disappear?
Well, it would be very clear that when the contracts were awarded, that the providers knew the attachment fees would disappear. That was something they understood, and they modelled their financial performance on the back of that. Yeah,
but my question is, that's one thing for them to know it's going to happen. It's quite another thing for it to happen, and them as a result as a company to go down the tube.
Yes, but I think there are 2 points to make. First of all, is that we do monitor very carefully the financial position of work programme providers. That's something that Julia's team do. And we understand their financial position, but also I don't think it'd be right to keep people at an underperforming work programme provider if they're not, just simply because we weren't sure about the financial viability of the provider.
But again, what's the chance of anyone else coming into the market if there is no attachment fee and there's nothing up front that they would be able to take on some of the work that's been left behind?
Well, I think my experience has been there's no shortage of people who are keen to take part in this market.
Okay, right. Back to you, Stephen.
Right. One of the things that has come out from a number of the providers is that the 2-year length of time is a good thing, because it gives us the time and space to work on getting those harder to get to, say, job ready or jobs to that position, and that's a good thing. However, what's also come out is realistically the sort of numbers that the primes are saying to us that they're hoping to be able to get into sustainable jobs is around about 30-40%, if I use that figure fairly loosely, because it's guesswork at the minute. But that means that with the best will in the world, anywhere between 60, 65, 70% perhaps at the end of those 2 years clearly are not going to be in posts. What arrangements and plans have the DWP started putting together to actually manage that number of people who perhaps aren't in sustainable employment after 2 years, and B, actually support them in a way that their confidence then wouldn't be completely shot and it would be impossible to ever get them a job. So do you get my point? That's quite a large cohort, it's a very large cohort, and there needs real underpinning plans to manage those folk, and also to maybe help working with them, because they may eventually get work.
No, I think, Mr. Lloyd, I think that's an important point, and we'll have been through a situation where people would have been on, let's assume it's someone who's 25 and over, they would have been unemployed for a year, at least a year when they joined the programme. They would have spent 2 years on the programme and have obviously returned to Job Centre Plus, and we need to think, well, what do we do to help them back into work? Now, it may be that a number of those people will have had work experience during that time. They may have started a job, they may not have got a job outcome, but they should have, hopefully would have found some work. And I think a quarter of those broadly a quarter of those who'd been referred to the programme had, by the end of September last year, had some work. What we need to do is to look at what else can we do that will move them closer to the labour market. And we did a couple of pilots last year where we published evaluations of these, so I can sort of talk about them reasonably freely. One was for perhaps those who are closer to the labour market, something called community activity placement. They would do a combination of some making some contribution to the community and at the same time doing job search. Or for those who are further away from the labour market, there's something called OCM, ongoing case management, trying to do some more intensive work, building on what the work programme would have done with people, to identify what the barriers were to them getting back into work, and what the right interventions were. And they may be interventions that Job Centre Plus can do by themselves. It may be that we have to buy in interventions using our flexible support fund. But I think, the evaluations on both those proved to be reasonably effective. And it struck me in talking to some of the advisors in the East Midlands, I think it was trialled in Leicestershire and Derbyshire, that actually it was effective. It actually really reaching out to some of the hardest to place and finding employment opportunities. So we are thinking about this, and it's something the department is very much focused on at the moment. And we'd hope to be able to make more announcements in due course.
And if I can drill down a wee bit on the due course, because it's not too long in the foreseeable future, could you give the committee some sort of indication of perhaps when the department might publish some outline plans about what you would be proposing to do with those individuals? If you give some sort of broad outline.
Well, I think what we would hope to do, assuming there's agreement for colleagues, is use for those who are furthest away from the labour market, something based on those two interventions. But people who've had 6 or 9 months' work whilst on the work programme, perhaps, but are unemployed at the time when they leave, the fact that they've had that work demonstrates they can we should be able to return to the labour market. And of course what we're trying to do through the work programme is to encourage sustainable employment, rewarding providers for getting people into work for 6 months or longer. So I'd hope that...
so will there be a son of work programme for those who have got some hope of getting work?
And I think what I'd say, Dame Anne, is there will be more intensive support for those who've returned who haven't had much work experience or haven't had much employment on the work programme. I'm very keen, I'm just really keen to make sure that we do as much as we can to help the long-term unemployed back into work. There are some big barriers there are some challenges. We do need to provide some support beyond the work programme for those people who do return.
And to be fair, a percentage of that 60-70%, I think you're quite right, may have had 6 or 7 months work, and through bad luck the company may have gone bust and so they'd lost their job. So I would expect them to be pretty job ready, which I think would be a success of the work programme. But I don't underestimate the reality that a percentage of that 60-70% or whatever, and I don't know how high or how low it will be, clearly are folk who will need just some additional support or networks or programmes to maybe reduce that level even further into long-term work. So I suppose the point I'm making is I think some of them, probably the JCP can shift them on quite quickly because they may hopefully be job ready because they may just have lost their job after a few months. But are the DWP cognizant of the fact that there will be a percentage that some proper additional support will be necessary, and you will be publishing those ideas or details in due course?
Yes, absolutely. No, I recognise that absolutely there will be some people who return from the work programme, who will have moved closer to the labour market but not close enough to be work ready, and they will need additional support and continued support, and we'll provide that over and above the existing Job Centre Plus offer.
Thank you.
I'll bring Glenda in.
Well, simply on that additional support, I mean, your supplementary estimates show that, 248 million will have to go back to the Treasury 12-13 because job outcomes have been lower than expected. So you're actually saying that your budget, is that budget going to be ring-fenced for you? Could you go to the Treasury and say, look, sorry, we need this money back because we have to put in greater support?
No, it is a ring-fenced budget.
So no money is going back to the Treasury?
No, so that means the underspend has to go back to the Treasury.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
Could you make the argument that because the programme hasn't worked in certain areas, that isn't in fact an underspend, it's a delayed spend?
Well, you can be assured that we'll be deploying all the arguments possible to the Treasury to make sure this programme is funded.
Is that a commitment?
Well, it is, we discuss with Treasury colleagues. Mrs. Jackson was a minister and she knows the process as well as I do, I think.
Lower down the feeding chain than you, Minister.
I tell you what I'm concerned about, Minister. We're talking about possibly 60 or 70% of people who've been through the work programme for 2 years who still haven't got a job. They'd already been unemployed for a year to get anywhere near the work programme in the first place. So they've been out of work, perhaps continuously. Now, that's a large number of people out of work continuously for 3 years by this time. If Job Centre Plus and all their interventions in the first year hadn't worked, if the work programme with all its interventions, which was meant to be very intensive and much more specialised in all of those things, and our report will show whether we believe that's the case or not, but it hasn't worked, what on earth's going to work in year 4?
Well, I think it's a good challenge, Dame Anne, and you're absolutely right. Someone who is getting to that point, if they have had no work in that 3-year period, there are some really big issues to deal with, and so
But isn't that what the work programme was meant to? That was what was sold to us as.
Let's be very clear. You criticised earlier on the MPLs, I think, for being too ambitious. They assume that 40%.
I'm just asking the question.
Yes,
not merely.
I think we recognise, and the MPLs recognise, we're not necessarily going to get everybody who is on the work programme into 6 months employment. I think we're sufficiently realistic about the effectiveness. But I think the challenge is that there are people, I think, who may have been unemployed for a lot longer than a year. Maybe people who've gone in and out of JSA and training allowance, for example, and who've actually been unemployed for way more than a year before they joined the work programme in reality, who are dealing with alcohol issues, other substance abuse issues, perhaps poor level of qualifications. They may not.
But we accept all of that. But the way that the work programme was promised, and indeed the contractors we've spoken to actually see the difference about the work programme compared to previous ones is they've got the person for 2 years, and they're quite hopeful that they can do the best they can for the person in 2 years. But that might still not be a job.
No, absolutely right, Dame Anne. I'm not denying that at all. And performance metrics demonstrate that we're very, very clear about the minimum levels of success we expect to get. We don't expect to get 100% of people on the work programme into work. So there will be people come out from the other end who are actually, who still have significant barriers to getting into work. I was talking to a provider last week, to give you an example, a provider in the southwest, and this is an ESA participant in the work programme, who hasn't left the house for some years. Actually, to get them into work may not be as easy as 2 years. It may require a longer period of time. And I just think the group of people we're dealing with, do have some quite deep-seated challenges in some cases to get them into work. And we can't give up on them. So we can't say at the end of 2 years of the work programme, well, we've tried our best for the last 3 years, that's it, you're off our hands. We've got to do something else for them. And that's why we've looked at OCM and CAP as a way to give more intensive support, particularly to those people who've been on the work programme for 2 years but actually haven't had much by way of work.
I think Debbie was going to say something,
Does that not mean, the example that you gave, Minister, and I don't, I believe your sincerity in wanting to do the best for this group, but does that not mean then the work programme isn't the right thing for them? Somebody that's not been able to get out of the house, surely, although they may have all the qualifications in the world, they haven't been able to get out of the house for 2 years. It would indicate that they have a more intensive level of need other than being able to just supply them with a job. And, it's about getting it right for that person right at the beginning. And to have gone through, as Dame Anne says, gone through a programme that doesn't meet the need, doesn't get them back into job, and puts them back on a revolving door into the system, what position do you think they're going to be worse after having gone through it than better?
No, I don't agree with that, because I think what we should be doing is trying throughout the work, either work programme does or Job Centre Plus does, is to try and remove those barriers. Sometimes it's about removing them one at a time. Others, the barriers might be relatively low, you can remove those barriers quite quickly. But we've had situations where people have been written off on things like incapacity benefit for 15 years and actually been found fit for work. The barriers about getting them into work after 15 years of being written off by society and by the state shouldn't be underestimated. And I don't think it's an overnight job in helping them back into work. But that's why it's important to give the work programme 2 years in which to help them, but also to recognise there may be more intensive support they need when they come out.
Okay, I'm going to Nigel and then back to you.
A group of people, the Minister, who have got to the end of the work programme and are kind of nearly there, but just not quite. It does seem a bit of pity to not give them that final help or shove, depending perhaps which way we are. One option would be to switch them over to the other work programme provider in the area and perhaps give them some kind of incentive to really push these people. Because we're talking here about programmes which are using future benefit savings to justify themselves. Is there any scope for saying, actually, provider 1 has failed, let's give provider 2 a chance to really push them into work?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, but about what should a prime contractor be able to provide further services in the future, and I think we're careful about what sort of message that sent about incentives to primes, and should they be able to provide.
I was saying it would be the other prime.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It wouldn't be the same one.
Yeah, and I think it depends in a way on just how extensive the post-work programme support is. I think you might be suggesting that actually almost start from scratch with a new provider. But certainly I think in our post-work programme support we need to think about the roles that primes could play in that.
Okay, Glenda, on to your questions.
Yes, it's all around this area really. I've already touched on the differential pricing, which doesn't seem to be effective. And you said yesterday in the Chamber during the Back to Work Schemes Bill that up to the end of September 200,000 people found work as a consequence of the work programme. People I'm trying to figure out, people have got work through the work programme. I'd like to know where that figure comes from. and B, whether you can define what constitutes work in the meaning that you presented to us. I mean, if I go on to the main thrust of this, URSA's Day 1 job start data, for example, show that job starts for ESA and XIB claimants are way, way behind the main JSA group, less than 1%, compared to nearly 37% in the JS 18 to 24 group. So again, for the third time, why is differential pricing not having the intended impact on job outcomes in the ESA and XIB groups? And could I, just before you start answering that, I'll throw another one at you. We have been continually, the government has continuously said that the centrepiece of the work programme was to get the hardest to reach people, those who had been unemployed for longest. The example you gave was a precise one that has already been given by other ministers, to get them back to work. And our understanding was that the primes got their contracts because they could show government that they had the support, the expert, experienced support coming from other groups to be able to deal with some of these hardest to reach groups. Well, it isn't happening, so I hope you've not forgotten the original two questions.
So
I should have cut her off after one, so you could have answered them one at a time. But
yeah, okay, you pick and choose, but let me go through the questions.
Okay.
So the job start data was provided by URSA, the trade body,
Yeah.
And so they collect that data from each of the primes in their organisation. Julie, can you remind me how they classify work?
That's an entry into a job, so that's at the start of the process that would take them into a job outcome should they reach the 6-month point.
Does it cover how long they're actually in that job? We know people go in one day and are out of work at the end of the week.
It's everyone who has started a job. And that's
But
why...
it doesn't tell you how long that job runs.
Not in that measure, no, but just talks about job starts.
Right.
And obviously it's the job outcomes which are predominantly for 6 months
Right.
or longer. I think the issue, and I think it's a fair challenge about why were there fewer job starts for ESA claimants. I certainly think it's the case that when the programme started, and this is something I suspect that primes would have said and given evidence to you, it's something they bend my ear about quite a lot, is that at the start there was quite a large volume, in fact probably larger than expected volume of JSA claimants referred to the work programme. The referral rates for ESA claims were much lower than originally forecast. Those forecast volumes are now picked up to broadly where primes expected them to be. And I think one of the answers from primes is that without sufficient volumes of ESA claimants, they felt they weren't in a position to either use the specialist suppliers they put in as part of their contract at that point, or develop the expertise and experience to deal with people who are ESA claimants and the challenges that they faced. And actually quite a lot of the providers, either at prime or subcontractor level, have had experience elsewhere dealing with people with disability and getting back into work, and certainly it's a very strong strand of people's experience in Australia, for example, where many of the providers deal with both JSA and ESA claimants. I think now the volumes are flowing through. Certainly my experience of talking to primes and their supply chain is I think they're now raising their game, and rightly so, frankly. On this group of claimants, they were not performing very well. They know that the department's very focused on what they're doing. Now the volumes are flowing through. Much greater use, I think, of specialist subcontractors. Much greater innovation taking place, I think, in the way in which they support people in the ESA group. So, for example, I talked to one prime who's using healthcare professionals in their delivery. So people, to give advice on, some medical issues that will help them remove the barriers to work. Different groups are looking at other ways of providing motivational courses using CBT, for example. So I think what we're now seeing is the providers really gearing up to support ESA groups. And I hope that when the figures are published in May, we'll demonstrate a real change in the way in which these people in the ESA groups are getting into work.
Well, I'm sure the committee will be very interested in that evidence because it
just
runs absolutely contrary to the evidence we've received so far.
Can I just ask a follow-up question, which I think is based on our visit yesterday, or largely based on our visit yesterday, but also something that was said when we had some of the providers in. One organisation in particular, which is now called, I think, CGD, or DG, which is a result of a recent merger with the Shaw Trust. But clear from the evidence they gave, both I think at one of our evidence sessions here and when we were at the job centre, that they are putting in a lot of extra effort, which is not coming out of the money that is coming into the work programme from government, because they do have other sources of funding. It included, for example, giving people kind of healthcare support, I think you were talking about, at approximately, I did write it down, I think it was about £900 a head, but that wasn't coming from the, and they didn't expect it ever, even if they got some of those people into work, they did not expect that to cover that, not least because some of these people weren't in any of the high category groupings anyway, even if they got them into work. So isn't what's happening there that some of that extra work may be being done, but it's not actually within the work programme contract?
Well, I think that clearly primes have the responsibility of managing their finances, and if they're able to access other sources of funding, that's their choice. But we are saying that for the hardest to help group, we'll pay up to £13,800. That's almost 4 times more, 3.5 times more than we pay for the lowest group.
That assumes two things here. It assumes that hardest to help group are correctly categorised, and a lot of the evidence we've had, there may be further questions on this, a lot of the evidence we've had is that they aren't necessarily. And the evidence of the prime providers yesterday was that they often don't distinguish, or they are trying not to distinguish. They're not putting those people away because they've actually been quite hard to help, but they haven't got the right money attached to them. But nevertheless, that hardest to work group, they're not always getting the money, even if they got them into a job, and a lot of them may not progress that far in the 2 years. So actually, the evidence from these people is they are having to put in extra money, which they do not expect to, within the pricing structure, to recoup. So if they are having some success, or they are putting in this personalised work that we expected, it is actually coming off another funding source. It's actually coming out of the work programme.
Well, that's not. I don't think there's anything particularly startling about that. For example, people on the work programme can participate in SFA-funded courses. There's no problem in accessing other sources of funding to support the work of the work programme. There's a limitation on that, but there's no problem about accessing that money where that's appropriate. And I think that the issue about are people differentiating or not, that's a matter for the primes. We've been very clear. We have given them operational freedom. We set minimum service levels in conjunction with them. It's a black box model. That means they are free to innovate, free to produce the best service possible. And if they don't differentiate, that's a choice that they make.
But that's not, again, it comes back to, we were being told at the beginning that the differential pricing structure would make a difference. Now, from a lot of the evidence we've got, no, it's not. The vast bulk of claimants going through the process are being treated as they would have done under any previous system. And the ones who are getting extra help may not be the ones that have the high price attached to them. And it's the primes or the subcontractor, whoever's delivering the service on the ground, are making the analysis as to who should get what appropriate help. And if the money is not available for them through the differential pricing structure, which it isn't, they're actually having to find other sources of funding, sometimes through their charitable giving.
Well, I think, Damon, I think there's a challenge actually for the work programme providers. And I think that there are some very expensive interventions out there. And I've talked to some specialist charities got some very expensive interventions. That's fine, people want to access those. I think one of the challenges is if we're going to provide a much more support to a much wider range of people, is how do we take those interventions and operationalise them so it can be available to more people. There isn't a bottomless pit here. And actually I think it does require people to be innovative, to look at what works, to look at how they can structure things in a way that will help.
But it's not, the point is it's not the pricing structure that's doing that. That's the point we're trying to say. It's not the pricing structure that is actually that's making them make those decisions. The contractors make those decisions.
For example, I mean, G4 has stated candidly rather, that the work programme would not be able to achieve job outcomes for homeless people or people with severe mental health conditions. St Mungo's told us that their homeless clients require support before they're ready to engage effectively with the work programme. So, as Damon said, despite the differential pricing structure, those people with the most complex barriers to work are simply being regarded as being too difficult and nobody's handling them. So, could there be, within the present structure, scope for establishing separate programmes for these job seekers? Even though we were told, to bore everyone by repeating, that the government's whole thrust with this policy was indeed to tackle and assist those people who were hardest to reach and to get into work.
So I think there are 2 points there. First of all, actually I don't think it's right to say the work programme can't help people who are homeless. And I've actually met people on the work programme who've been placed into jobs who are homeless. And I'll just counsel caution here. I'm not surprised that work programme providers are asking for more money. I mean, it's not. That's not. We shouldn't be surprised. They should take this opportunity to ask for some more money. But I do think they can get good outcomes. I've met people who've been helped into work with mental health conditions. Yeah. So I just.
That's what they were contracted to do.
Exactly.
I mean, it shouldn't be such a great surprise, surely, Minister.
But the point
they
is,
were contracted to do that job, and we're expected to applaud and say how wonderful it is they've got people into jobs with mental health
Miss
problems.
Gilmore, what I'm saying is, they can get them into work.
Yeah.
Your colleague, Miss Jackson, was saying they can't. And I'm actually making your point, Miss Gilmore, that actually they can get into work. And I think the contractors are capable of giving people the help they need to get into employment. But I do think what they need to do, and thinking about the value for money, is think about what's the most effective way to get people into employment.
Well, but are you going to account for the extra money? I mean, I'll ask this because I think it is important. If, in fact, I'm hoping these people are successful, and a lot of what we heard yesterday was actually very encouraging, and the kind of approaches that the Shaw Trust and others are taking. But it is clear, it would appear to be clear, that to do that, to make that progress with people and give them things like that medical support and help managing their condition, rather than medical support, it was about helping to manage their condition so that they could reach that floor from which they could progress, then is that going to be factored in when we decide how much this programme has cost? Because one of the things that has been said and will be said is this government has measured its work programme against previous work programmes on the basis that this was going to be the cheapest, much cheaper, therefore much better value for the taxpayer. But if in fact the reality is that it has to be subsidised from other sources, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I think it's a good thing, but we have to be realistic, do we not, about the cost?
Well, the cost to the taxpayer is the amount of money we spend on the programme. If providers seek to supplement the money we pay them on something against an outcome from other sources, that's their choice. That's not a choice that's available to commercial organisations.
Could I just...
who expect to make a profit from this.
But the issue that I didn't raise the issue, I did not say that homeless people can't be found work. This was the evidence that has been presented to the committee on an actual field trip. Members of the committee heard that not infrequently Job Centre Plus don't even know the individual they're dealing with is homeless. Yesterday on a field trip, the evidence was presented to the committee that in many instances homeless people Job Centre Plus doesn't even know their phone numbers, and it's not unusual for homeless people to actually keep that kind of information to themselves. That's not the central issue here. The central issue is that a programme was set up which we were told was going to concentrate specifically on the hardest to reach. There was a pricing differential. Apparently £1 billion has already been spent, and we have received evidence that the most difficult clients are being parked.
Well, I think, Ms Jackson, what we should do...
It used to be called Creandon Park, it's just parked.
I think what we should do is wait until the results come out in May and see what the evidence...
almost 18 months.
But I can't, unfortunately, what I can't do is tell you what the results are to date. I'm not allowed to do that. We should wait and see what progress. But Julia wants to add something.
Can I just give a couple of examples of some of the structures that are in place? I mean, the health issue is a really interesting one. Some providers are dealing with it through mainstreaming their service. So some work programme providers have occupational health therapists available to anybody who feels they need help with health and well-being. They're delivering very well across the board and delivering good outcomes for ESA customers. On the blended funding question, it's a really interesting one. One of the things we wanted work programme providers to do was to innovate and to enhance services to unemployed people. So some of the best providers are bringing together a whole host of services funded by other agencies and delivering them coherently to work programme participants. So there's one centre in Birmingham where they have justice, skills, health and education monies all in the same place. They have a credit union in there as well. And work programme participants get the blended help that they need, not all funded by the work programme, but actually that enables them to achieve outcomes more efficiently and more effectively than if that work programme participant had to go to 5 venues, visit 5 different people and try and join it up themselves. So I think there are very different approaches. We will get a sense, I think, as we head into year 2 and year 3, how that innovation is playing out in terms of outcomes, which groups are benefiting the best, and that there will inevitably, I think, be some groups where there are some real funding or supply issues in terms of the help that they need, because we've not worked with them in this work-focused way before. But I think there are lots of answers, and we will know which are the best delivery mechanisms pretty soon.
The black box. That was the answer we were given. The black box, which was innovation. It was all going to be wonderful. What you're now saying, and that's not the only. Can I just finish this one question?
Yesterday's field trip,
Yeah.
which actually you didn't attend, so I just want to I would like to actually put some questions to the witnesses in relation to that.
That if there is best practice, is the department actually going to spread that best practice around all the primes, or will it take the contract away from primes who aren't doing it?
We're doing it in real time, and the market is doing it themselves. Providers are also sharing good practice. They really care about getting this right and delivering performance to the levels that we expect.
Yeah. Well, I was just following up actually on the point that Ms Sweeney was just saying. We did actually hear some very interesting evidence and some positive, some negative yesterday. But actually, a number of the primes that we met on our trip to Brent yesterday morning were very positive about some very, very hard to reach groups. And we did pose the question to them about how they were using that experience and, if you like, how they were sort of trying to harness best practice. And it sounds like you have some thoughts of centrally doing that, and I just wondered when you said you're going to look across a scheme at how people are working, particularly with hard to reach groups, what are you going to do with that information?
So I think there are 2 things. First of all, we will be evaluating this scheme as we always do, and using evidence to demonstrate the effectiveness of different approaches. But we're also setting up a best practice group to look at some challenges. Look at some of the hard-to-help groups and work out what is working well and what isn't working well. And that's not necessarily being prescriptive, because different organisations have their own style. But I had a meeting with Gingerbread, for example, where we talked about how work programme providers work with lone parents. And some dreadful examples of practice, and some great examples of practice. So even simple things like ensuring that you ask a lone parent in for an interview when their child is at school or has got care. It sounds very straightforward, doesn't happen all the time. So there are some practical guides we can find. We can share different approaches to use of healthcare professionals. Are they mainstreamed? Did they get specialist contractors in to provide that? So I think it is that free flow of information discussion that we want to promote through a best practice group. That is very different, though, to say this is the DWP way and this is what you should do, because providers will have different approaches. But what we need to do is get more data out there about these approaches and what they feel works well in their situation.
Linda, you finished?
Well, it was just...
if you ask the question on what choice...
Exactly. I mean, in the light of your experience of programmes that work and programmes that don't work, is there a possibility that you could be looking at additional work programmes that really are looking at, in a much more detailed way, at some of the hardest to reach flown tell.
Like
Yeah.
specifically, we're talking about work choice.
Yes.
We've
Sorry,
anecdotally,
work choice.
we've heard good things, but then we don't have the data to back that up. But almost all our witnesses say, "Oh, but work choice is doing well."
Yes,
It'd be interesting to see the data.
I mean, work choice is the responsibility of the Minister for Disabled. But I actually, as it happens, I went to visit a work choice provider in my constituency on Friday, where it was actually MenCap who work with CDG Wise. And I think there are some good things we can learn from work choice, about the amount of in-work support that is offered. And I spoke to MenCap, who employs somebody through work choice, but also the Cooperative Wholesale Society, CWS, who employ people through work choice. In-work support is absolutely vital, but of course what work choice is able to do, is provide support beyond a fixed period, and provide more extensive support. And I think some of the lessons from work choice can be used in the work programme. For example, how do you get an employer to think about how a job can be broken down into manageable chunks for someone who's been absent from the labour market for a while? How can we support employers to make reasonable adaptations to their processes, might be to say recruitment, to help people?
On that specific question, if I can, Dave, do you have a view about possibly allowing the work programme providers to have access to work? Because, for instance, as I think I mentioned you before, if you have, say, a deaf person who uses sign language, BSL has been away from the job market for a long time, maybe 10 years. That individual is going to need a fair amount of interpreting provision to go through the interviews, to be trained, to then go for the job interviews, but they're not actually allowed to access to work, which is a very good scheme. But is it possible that the DWP might think about joining up those dots?
I think it's something that we do need to think about. I think there is a difficulty about work programme and work choices. They both work through prime contractors, and they are rewarded separately for that. But I think we should be looking at how can we utilise these schemes to the best effect and join them up.
What about pre-work programmes?
Well, the pre-work programme is for, this is often the support that Job Centre Plus will offer. And we do give Job Centre managers quite a lot of flexibility about what they can offer. We've devolved budgets down to managers to enable them to buy services to meet particular needs. So, to give you an example, the Cardinal Hume Centre, which is not very far from here, very, very good integrated service. Julie was talking about the one in Birmingham where all the services are brought together. Cardinal Hume Centre does the same thing. Actually, Job Centre Plus buys in support for homeless from the Cardinal Hume Centre. And I think the Flexible Support Fund is there to be used to provide intensive interventions, intensive support to people of some distance from the labour market. We don't want people to have to wait until the work programme before they get access to this. And I think Job Centre Plus also do buy in services from other homelessness charities as well.
And is that budget a separate budget?
Yes, it's very much separate from the work
Yes.
programme, and it's very much under the control of Job Centre Plus managers.
The work choice, the numbers going into work choice are capped, and again, some of the evidence suggests that they could make a lot more use of work choice if it wasn't capped. Is that something that you're looking at?
Well, I think the best thing to do, Dame Anna, is to get my colleague Esther Bay to drop your line on the stats.
So of course, it's also not payment by results, so there's a very different funding model for it.
Absolutely,
as well, and that's the thing. Debbie.
Yes, our committee has heard evidence from witnesses that the pricing structure, which is generally related to the benefit type that claimants are on, is a bit of a blunt instrument. And we wondered whether the department, whether the government is considering a more holistic approach to assessing employment needs, employability, and within that relating both the pricing structure and the interventions that would be appropriate, such as some of the very good ones that you've just talked about, would be available.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think what we have is a range of approaches to identifying the payment groups that people should be in and the amount of money that should be linked to that payment group. So, for example, there's a separate payment group for ex-offenders. There is, we just launched a pilot where there's additional funding for people who've got drug and alcohol problems, and there are people who've been referred to payment groups by virtue of the benefit that they are claiming. So I think I would say there are a mixture of approaches to identifying why people are in different payment groups. It's not just about benefits. But I do think that, I think you do raise an important point. And it's something that we need to think about quite carefully, both in context of the interpretation of the results, but also future direction of policy. There will be people on job seekers allowance, for example, who have mental health conditions. Mm-hmm. There are a number of people on job seekers allowance who will be self-declared as disabled, using the sort of DDA methodology, who won't go into one of the groups with the higher payment. And that's why I think it's quite interesting the approach that providers take. Some will not seek to differentiate between payment groups, but provide a wide range of services to every payment group, such as having occupational health available to everybody. Some will perhaps triage on a range of different factors, including employability, and not necessarily by benefit.
Well, on that point, then they must have to be doing some form of assessment. So that would seem a very good example, good model that was being used that you've given. Presumably, they will have had to assess. So are you actively considering a more holistic assessment that relates to the whole person's needs, including their employability? For example, we heard about the Australian job seeker classification instrument. I know about New Zealand several years ago, had a more holistic approach in terms of identifying the overall needs for the person.
No, I think it's something actually, I think it's a broader point, and not just related to the work programme. I think one of the things that the Secretary of State and I are interested in is looking at much more segmentation for job seekers when they walk in through the door. And you're absolutely right, in Australia they've got the job seeker classification instrument. I think it's, having seen it, I think there's some benefits to it. I think there's some challenges too. But I think, and we need to think about that in connection with future policy development. But I think it's a very interesting idea, and one that we're looking at quite carefully.
Can I just ask on that, who do you think should carry out the assessment? Because we had some different evidence on this from people. Should it be done, because I think some of us are probably a little anxious about whether that should be done by providers, who after all might have a vested financial interest in assessing somebody as high need. So at what point in the process do you think that might take place?
Well, I think you're right to highlight that concept about providers. The flip side is, and this is some of the anecdotal feedback I got from meeting some of the Australian providers, was that having the government to do it means that sometimes the banding between the four categories varies depending on budget pressures. But I think what you need to do... It's an
interesting question.
It is, absolutely. No, I think it is an interesting question. And I think what you need to do, though, Ms Gilmore, is have an approach that commands confidence, that has credibility, a recognition that perhaps people's distance from the labour market changes over time, and it's not necessarily all in the same direction. Someone may actually fall ill whilst on the work programme and actually move further away from the labour market. So it shouldn't necessarily be fixed at any point in time. It should be reviewed from time to time, potentially. And of course, and the method of assessment is important too. Ms Jackson referred to people not necessarily declaring that they're homeless at job centres. And this was a comment that was made in Australia in connection with the job seeker classification tool that they used, that it was based on a very short interview. People didn't necessarily admit to having mental health issues or being homeless. So I think we need to think quite carefully about it, how effective it is, and are we sure that it will deliver a much more targeted and focused use of resources.
Moving on to assessment for fitness for work, and we heard some horror stories when we've received evidence. One man that had been assessed as fit for work, who actually had cancer and died a few weeks after he was deemed fit for work, and that was the evidence from the provider. I know things are improving, but it's still far from perfect around the work capability assessment. So how can providers refer back into the system those beneficiaries who should not be there, who should genuinely not be there?
Well, I think the challenge here is to ensure that we do get the work capability assessment right. So we are ensuring people get the right support. And I think you are also right. I think we are seeing improvements in that. There's still some way to go. I'm the first to acknowledge that. And because it is that assessment and and then the decision made by DWP staff, which determines which group people go into, whether it's fit for work, whether it's the ESA RAG group or the support group. If there is a view that someone's condition actually doesn't enable them to benefit from the work programme, then there's an appeals mechanism in place.
So there's no direct referral then for the providers back into JCP, which is...
No, and I think I can see the argument for doing it, and don't get me wrong, but equally what I'm also very wary about is making it too easy for providers to say, I don't want to work with this person, let's pretend they're not fit enough for work. So I think we've got to have some checks and balances in this. But
I understand that argument, Debbie, if I can chip in, and there's some legitimacy to it, but by the same token, when we had a group of work providers in only the other day, we asked them very directly, was it getting better? They said, yes, it was. And we also asked them very directly, are you all, and I include Shaw on this, who's on the charity side, are you all still receiving referrals from people who are clearly not fit to work? They all said yes. So my question to the DWP is this. I'm very supportive of the model of payment by results, 100%. Been in business years for in politics. My question to DWP is, why is there no payment by results mechanism for ATOS who do the WCA, either based on appeals or successful, whichever way you define it? So I'm not clear that the same performance by results robustness that you have with the work providers is applied to the company that does the WCA, and it's clear those things are getting better. I don't think it's getting better quickly enough.
Well, I don't want to sort of go back to I think my first evidence session in front of the committee, but I would just say...
But they are connected.
No, absolutely. No, I think the couple of things I'd say. The first is this. I think that if we brought in a payment by results mechanism for ATOS, I am sure people would find ways in which they felt that the system was being organised to get more people declared fit for work. And I think actually paying people for a process and something like that, where actually the outcome is what is the right prognosis for this person based on the evidence that's being presented, is much better to be paid by the number of people you see rather than setting any targets, because targets can open for misinterpretation, to manipulation, to distortion, and I would really be uncomfortable about going down that route. Where, of course, ATOS failed to deliver the service we expect in terms of volumes, then there is a service credit that comes back for that. But the other thing I would say is the ESA claimant group, PG6, what we're saying, we're referring people to that claimant, to that payment group, who aren't necessarily fit for work now. They would actually be on JSA. What we're saying is they would be fit for work perhaps in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, up to a year's time. And what we're expecting the work programme providers to do is to use that time to move them closer and closer to work. So absolutely right, they're not fit for work the day they appear, because otherwise they'd be on JSA. But what we're saying is over the next up to a year, we expect them to be fit for work, rather than wait until they are fit for work to get started. Let's give them some help now that's appropriate to their medical condition, rather than writing that year off.
I do take your point, and I think that's a fair point. All that I would toss it back is I would urge that the DWP continues to keep a very, very close watch on the appeals process. If after Harrington, which I was totally supportive of, and a lot of the changes that were put in, if we are still getting a large number of successful appeals, if we define it that way, i.e. the appeal decides they clearly were not fit for work, then I would urge that the DWP doesn't write off any further possible sanctions to improve the quality of outcomes, because it was only 2 weeks ago when they were sitting in front of us, and I think these are reasonably sensible people, even though I know they have, they would say it to a certain extent, but I don't think the Shaw Trust would, or CDG or what they were called. So I do urge you as the Minister within the DWP to keep a very continual close eye on that, on the level of improvement, or not?
Absolutely, Mr Lloyd. And I think we are committed to continued improvement at WCA. We've just appointed Malcolm Harrington's successor, Dr. Paul Litchfield. So rather than having, we've had Harrington's 1, 2 and 3, we'll have Litchfield 1 and 2. And we are, I monitor this process very, very closely, because I want to make sure we get better outcomes from the whole WCA process.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to bring Teresa in, because she hasn't spoken, and then I'm going to go back to Debbie, if that's fine.
Minister, just on the point you raised about the Atos contract, and you said if you set a target, that could, would be not a very good thing, and it's better for people to be rewarded or paid for the number of people they see. I think the point that Stephen was making was, yes, that's fine, but they need to get the decision right, and there seems to be no penalty in there. In most contracts you would be expect to get things right X amount of the time, and there will be a flex at the end to say, okay, we accept that a few will be wrong. But so many go to appeal that, and I know that Atos have been paid extra for the Harrington improvements, but it seems that it's a one-sided contract. If they do things better, they get more money, but if they do things worse, there is no penalty that you can invoke. Would you look at that?
Well, I think one of the challenges, Ms Pearce, is that Atos can make a recommendation which DWP then have to make a decision themselves. So actually the decision on which group somebody goes into is not made by Atos, it's actually made by the department, using recommendations from Atos, but also the medical evidence that GPs and others have requested. So we should be clear where the decision-making focus is on this. And the reality is, if you look at the drop-down menu that tribunal judges are completing, I think it's about 0.04% of cases the reason why the judges overturning the department's decisions down to quality of Atos assessment. And actually, one of the principal reasons why decisions are being overturned is because more recent information was supplied by the claimant. And of course, Atos nor the department hasn't had a chance to see that.
But then there's a profound systemic problem from the DWP.
Right, I'm going to, because we could go on forever on this, and I suspect we might need an extra evidence session to do that. So I'm going to move back to Debbie and the questions that she had.
Just one final.
Yeah.
It relates to the work-focused health-related assessment, which you'll recall was specifically about assessing how a claimant's condition might be managed to help them find and stay in work. That was suspended by the DWP in 2010, and we wondered, what the reason was for not reinstating it. And surely this will actually help providers, and again in a more generic assessment about how people can, say, find and stay in work.
No, I think it's a good question, and we have looked again at whether this should be reinstated. I think my sense is that it would, at the moment, I think, be duplicating what the work programme should be doing, which is trying to work out what someone can do and trying to find the right job for them and their health condition. But it is something that we keep under regular review, and we'll think about again shortly. But I think it has potential, but I think in a way it's been superseded by where we're at.
Okay, thank you. Nigel.
So just before I stop, Jen, I'd just like to say some of the examples used as if it's the lowest common denominator. When people sometimes die of cancer, from your background, sometimes it becomes a long-term condition, it can be a short-term condition. Some people die within weeks of diagnosis. So to use that as an example, I think it's a bit...
The example that was given, Graham, to be fair, that was the example that G4S gave. That was
if you look at Tony Gubber, a well-known radio personality, died of cancer after a very short illness. He died within 3 weeks. Sometimes it's very difficult to diagnose. That's the point I'm making.
Anyway, on to Nigel. Okay. Thanks, Minister.
Can I take you back to the black box approach, Minister, which we touched on earlier? You get any regrets about how that approach was set up?
Well, I have to say, when first of all, it was my predecessor who established this.
Exactly, it's no blame for you.
No, but I've reflected on this, and I think it was the right approach. I think that it is right to give a group who are on the whole actually some very very experienced providers the flexibility to determine what is right. Obviously, it's underpinned by minimum standards, and I did actually have the chance to look at the alternative to this. In Australia, the element which is outcome payments is much lower than the UK. They get more payments for inputs. And I felt that one of the issues there was it actually almost squeezed out innovation and flexibility from the system. I think the alternative is to have share best practice and lots of rigorous evaluation to find out what works rather than be prescriptive. Because I do feel that the local labour markets differ, the nature of the people referred to the scheme differs. So I think they should have different. I think it's right to experiment with different approaches, so long as they're successful.
And because the initial evaluation of the programme, we found there wasn't quite a level of innovation going on that you were probably hoping for at the start. Do you actually think now the black box is actually delivering that innovation and the new approaches that it was kind of intended and expected to do?
Yeah, I think what had happened, and Julie might want to add some sort of colour to this, is I think at the start there was quite a long mobilisation phase, and a lot of people, perhaps who were existing providers, thought they could do what they did before and just that would be okay. And I think that there was a bit of a shock to the system when they didn't achieve the MPLs at the end of year one, and a real sense of what do we do that's actually going to drive up performance. And I think that has then led to quite a lot of innovation taking place. When I was in Gloucester last week, I went to visit one of the providers, JHP there, who are now doing some very specific and very intensive courses along a vocational pathway, and that is that's different to perhaps what they were doing 6 months ago. You've got a lot of providers who are perhaps focusing on self-employment now. We've got one provider who's looking at a virtual advisor to deal with remote areas. So I think there is a lot of innovation going on. You see a lot of innovation going on, I think, in the ESA area as well now compared to what it was. So I just sense there is a growing momentum as people think, what am I going to do to get to the next level of performance? What do I have to offer? Julia, what's your view?
Yeah, I think the first year was very much about scaling up and getting the service in place. Huge numbers of people participating in the work programme at the end of the first year. We're seeing some real innovation in the skills area, particularly with blended funding, tailored routes into work, linked to local labour markets and local employers. Some quite good examples coming up there. Employer engagement, very different models, and some interesting dimensions coming out there. In terms of structures, all the way from the way the managing agent role works in some providers through different supply chain relationships, they're all teaching us some very useful lessons about how the market operates. A lot on health, a lot of new approaches emerging on developing local partnerships and starting to get into the door with LEPs and local partners and thinking about how services are tailored, and some very different approaches on digital. These providers can do things with IT that we just can't within the department because of the scale of the build and the time that it takes. So I think, yes, we are seeing innovation. The critical question is whether innovation leads to better outcomes. For some, it certainly will. And for the department, understanding what's happening across 18 primes and 41 contracts and looking at what excellent looks like will give us some very good intelligence as we move into evaluation and think about what the next phase of delivery looks like.
So you're not sat in the department thinking, if only we had a bit more power or a bit of a lever to encourage some providers to do things that they're not doing or stop them doing things they
Our
are doing.
leverage is quite strong. The Minister talked at the beginning of this session about the capability we've got within the contracts to leverage good performance and to shift work and to take work away from people if they're not delivering. This is a very responsive contract. We've got very open relationships with providers. At account manager level, we're working very closely with chief executives of the primes, and performance managers are in delivery areas all the time. We know exactly what's happening. We know what good looks like. We share that information around the network. Primes do so themselves. We have a number of networks where we sit down with primes and their partners. So, yeah, I think there's a very dynamic relationship across this market. It's an exciting time for the market. We've got new entrants, we've got new structures, we've got people coming into the welfare to work area who haven't worked with us before. It's a very rich learning experience for the department, as well as an opportunity to drive good outcomes for customers.
I kind of take the point that if they're not meeting targets, you can do nasty things to them. But it's possible, isn't it, to meet the kind of overall target but not be performing very well for some perhaps particularly hard to reach parts of the cohort you've got. But in that situation, it'd be much harder for you to take any action. You couldn't divert people away from them in that situation, I don't think. So do you actually think that there was a case for having some standard in there which says actually you need to do at least this for everybody?
That standard exists.
So there is a minimum standard in place, and we've agreed that with each of the providers, and that's something we monitor compliance with. I think that don't underestimate the power of focus on some of these payment groups. And I think that it's quite interesting that talking to the primes who we've been very focused on JSA 18 24s, 25 plus. Actually, as we talk more about ESA claimants, you start to see a real sort of focus on that from the primes. But we do need, I think, to make sure that primes are held to account for every payment group, not just 3 principal payment groups.
Okay, so I'm sensing you're happy that the black box is working. Do you think there's a case for any independent oversight outside of the department on what primes are doing, perhaps some independent quality inspection or something?
Well, you've got, if you think about this, the participants' experience, when they go to their prime for the first time, they will, or the subcontractor, they'll be told what they should expect to see by way of service. You have an opportunity to raise complaints, and there's an independent case examiner who will actually adjudicate on those complaints. But a lot of the evaluation they do is also independent as well.
So, but how would a contractor be held to account?
Sorry.
How is if a contractor decides to just look at part of the cohort and ignore all the rest? There is nothing, because of the black box, there's nothing you can do to say, actually, well, you're not fulfilling, they might be fulfilling their minimum standards in their minimum levels in one area, but there's nothing really you can actually, so long as they're getting just enough people into jobs, there's nothing else that you can do.
No, but we do, Damon, take the compliance with minimum standards very seriously. And we do audit those. Judy, do you want to talk a bit about that process?
Yeah, I mean, the minimum standards articulate the level of service that a customer can expect from a provider. They're shared with that claimant as they move into the programme. And actually, if you go around and look at either primes or their subcontractors, those standards are quite explicitly there in the workplace and on websites. And there are customer feedback boards, and they change and enhance those in response to customer feedback in the main. Performance managers and our assurance team actually audit those standards, so we can be assured that people are seeing their advisors regularly, they're getting that service level.
But we know that that's not happening. We've heard somebody who sees their advisor for half an hour every week. Great. Someone who has to phone up their advisor and does so every couple of months to actually ask and beg for an appointment. So how can it be that I know is that the black box? That doesn't suggest as though there's any minimum standards.
Minimum service levels are not exactly the same across each prime contractor, but if they're not being met, the claimant has a very clear route to escalate that complaint. I mean, I think it's probably important to note that complaints are almost always resolved locally, which means they're resolved to the satisfaction of the claimant. We have very few getting to the independent case examiner, and in fact we've had none adjudicated on as upheld. So I think that says something quite positive about the experience people have within the
claimant doesn't
programme.
know what the obligation of the provider is.
But the claimant demand does get details of what the minimum service standard is when they sign on to the work programme. When they go and see their subcontractor or their prime, they should be given those details. So there should be very clear standards set at that point.
I haven't that no, that would be
So
interesting.
didn't even know they were on the work programme.
No, is it possible to monitor rather than use anecdotal evidence? I mean, is it possible to supply the committee with something
that would be useful.
Yeah,
just as well, because
that'd be very helpful.
So we can see how different they are in different areas, because it's quite difficult to know how they can be so different. But yeah, it's still hit the root.
No problem at all.
Okay. Right, I've lost where we are. Sheila.
Yeah, just before I think this is very, some of the examples that you've been giving are very interesting. Is there an independent research project going on in parallel with all of this, and is this going to be published? Because, what's being described here, frankly, doesn't look like what the work programme was perhaps. And the idea of having a hub with all sorts of services together is fantastically good. But that's not the same as the kind of work programme with its chain of suppliers and so on. So is somebody doing research so that will be published?
We're awash with evaluation, which will be published. I think that this almost goes back to the point about the black box. People have different models for the provision of specialist services. Some might be on one location, some might do it in a different way. So it depends on their business model and their
So it will be published?
approach. Yeah, the evaluation will be published, absolutely.
In terms of the supply chain, which was one of the things that from the outset was said to be important, when the BBC surveyed third sector organisations that were listed as contractors in the work programme by the DWP, they had responses from 184 organisations. 40% said they weren't part of the work programme. Of those who were in the work programme, 73% said they'd had fewer referrals than expected, and 41% had received no referrals. Were a lot of these organisations simply used as bid candy in the first place?
No, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that. What I would say is this, that and we talked about the mobilisation phase earlier on, we talked about the ramp-up of ESA volumes. A lot of these were specialist contractors that the work programme providers had lined up. I think as the programmes evolved, the nature of the relationship between primes and subcontractors and specialist provided services has evolved. Some services have been provided in-house that might have been subcontracted before. So I think there's a mix there, but one thing I do take comfort from is the last stock take we took of subcontractors. We'd actually seen an increase in the number of voluntary community sector organisations taking part, and they still by far away the biggest chunk of subcontractors in the programme.
So you're not of the view that the work isn't feeding down then? You think it is feeding down? So why have some subcontractors not actually got any work?
I'm not saying that it is feeding down. I'm saying that actually some subcontractors may have come in at the start of the programme, and perhaps that the primes felt like, actually I don't need this service anymore, or because the level of ESA volumes at the start was so low, actually it wasn't economic to refer people to a particular specialist subcontractor. So just saying, I think the supply chain is changing, it evolves. I was talking to primes who've actually taken people out of their supply chain because they weren't performing, or they weren't able to offer service at a reasonable price to the contractor. So I think there's a whole batch of reasons why people who might have been in at the start are no longer in now.
So what action can the DWP take against if there are actually they're not passing on the work and they're satisfied it's not for one of these good reasons?
Well, they're not required to pass on work. It is a black box. They've got to decide ultimately, how do they get the job outcomes? That's what they're being paid for. That's why we set up this programme, payment by results. So they've got to decide what is the best way to deliver better job outcomes. And I think one of the messages coming out to me from the way in which providers are responding to increased ESA referrals is where there are specialist services there from subcontractors, they'll tap into them. In some supply chains, and Julia talked about the managing agent model earlier, which G4S, for example, of all their work is subcontractors. There's maybe a changing roster of subcontractors depending on performance.
Some small organisations have gone out of business. Some were told, at least locally, that may have changed again, that with the coming of the work programme, then previous funding that they had, say through local authority, was not going to be forthcoming, because the theory was this was all coming into and I know this happened in Edinburgh, where people who were doing employability services previously under sort of various programmes, including some funded locally by local government, were told that since there was now the work programme, the local authority would no longer be funding that kind of activity because it was all supposed to be done under the work programme. So they've lost the funding from that they may have had through the local authority, and if they're not getting contracts or not getting as much as they expected through the work programme, then they are actually losing business.
Well, I can't be held accountable for the actions of local authorities, but I do think there's a real challenge here, and I think that the payment by results model we're using in the work programme does present some real challenges to contractors of all types and sizes. And I think one of my things I sense from talking to a range of providers is actually move from some of the previous funding models, where there's much more paid up front, much more paid for progress measures or particular interventions, and move to a payment by results model has been quite challenging for a lot of organisations. And of course, what we can't do is guarantee a certain level of referrals into the work programme. We can't stop people getting jobs before 12 months simply to keep the volume of referrals up.
But you have said on more than one occasion that there has been an increase in the ESA.
Yeah, absolutely.
Claims.
Yes. Yeah.
Any theory as to why that's happened?
Well, because actually, as the policy's bedded down, we've been able to release people with longer prognosis onto the work programme. So not just people who perhaps made the original stage was people who volunteered at ESA onto the programme, people who'd been through the IB reassessment process who could volunteer to go into the work programme. Now we're referring greater volumes as we refer people who've got a prognosis of up to 12 months onto the work programme. So we are seeing that policy shift, getting more volumes through, but I was thinking more particularly about the GSA volumes that we don't have a control over.
If most of the work is done by a subcontractor and they get somebody into work, or if all the work is subcontracted in effect, is it right that the prime gets still the large chunk of the money? It would appear not doing a lot.
Well, the prime then is in the position that it pays under its contractual obligations to the subcontractor the amount that's owed. And so there's, when subcontractors entered into commercial negotiations with a prime, they agreed a payment mechanism. And that payment mechanism varies from contract to contract. So you'll have some who are effectively bearing exactly the same end-to-end risk that the prime was, who will be paid on a payment by results basis. You have some specialist tier 2 providers who are paid on a call-off basis, paid for a service that's been delivered. But there are some commercial negotiations between the primes and their subcontractors.
Doesn't this come back down to whether there is really equal contracting? And for a lot of organisations, this did appear to be the only show in town, so it was take this or leave it.
Well, I think that
if you're paying 13,000, let's say, to somebody who is the hard to place, and so at the end of the day, somebody gets all that money for them being hard to place. If the work is done primarily by one subcontractor I know in my constituency, which works with people with mental health difficulties, most of the heavy lifting is done by that organisation.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get most of the fee. They get about half the fee.
Hey, I think there's a commercial negotiation here. Yeah, and actually the Prime won't get any payment if the organisation isn't investing enough and getting somebody into work. So actually it's in the Prime's interest to ensure there's fair recompense for the work that's being put in. Otherwise actually people won't go into work and they won't get any money at all. But I think there is a commercial negotiation here to be had. I think one of the challenges though, Ms Gilmore, is how do we ensure that people who are subcontracting this programme have the management capability and financial capacity to enter into some of these contracts. And I know a number of primes have done some good work with subcontractors to help boost that capacity to manage that risk. So this is not a risk-free operation, as I'm sure you appreciate.
So, I think we're going to move on. Graham wanted to add something here.
It's just, in fact, you've largely answered it, Minister. When we had evidence from G4S, they subcontract to their primes, and in their evidence, they said a lot of the third sector providers are just no good. And as you've said, it's a commercial decision whether you want to put yourself into that arena.
Yeah, I think there's a real challenge to actually anybody, because I think there's some private sector providers may not be any good either. Yeah, but I think there's and I think a number of contractors who've been long-established players in this market have found the transition from the payment by input to payment by result quite challenging, and have taken some time to adjust to that different model. And I do think it requires any organisation taking part in this needs to have financial strength and the capacity to manage what are risky contracts.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, no, we need to move on. I was going to ask about the Merlin standard, and it seems as though it's a toothless animal. It really doesn't do very much. Have you thought about giving more powers to Merlin assessors to be able to fine primes who treat the subcontractors unfairly?
Well, I think the Merlin standard is a good way of setting some very clear standards around the relationship there should be between a prime and a subcontractor. We have taken some steps to strengthen that. Michael O'Toole is a prime representative for the voluntary community sector, is now sitting on the board that supervises this, but we do monitor compliance with it as well, which I think is important. I think in terms of future development of penalties, let me think about that one. But Judy, do you want to talk a bit more about the Merlin approach and whether it can be strengthened?
Yes, I can do. I think Merlin has been a relatively effective instrument, actually. The formalisation of the relationship through the sector has been really helpful. The board is active. We recently had an organisation achieve an excellent on Merlin for the first time, so it shows that that process is driving up standards. We've also had an organisation fail, who will need, as a consequence, to be reassessed. So I do think we're using the breadth of the standard, and the work that Michael will do with us will be very welcome. But the sense I get from the industry and industry representatives is actually this is a good mechanism that's providing a good structure around our subcontractors.
But there were presumably no penalty on the organisation that failed. They just get the chance to take the test again, if you like.
Yeah, and there is a penalty therein because they have to pay for that test.
How much?
I can't remember the exact amount. I can drop a note to the committee if you'd like to know.
Get a sense that there's if something seriously needed to be dealt with in terms of the relationship between primes and subs, that actually Merlin wouldn't be there to step in and help.
I get the sense when I visit subcontractors and primes on the work programme that relationships through the supply chain are pretty good. This is a very collegiate delivery organisation when you look across supply chains. There's a very strong focus on delivery and a very good, healthy sense of competition in terms of delivering well. And I think that Merlin is part of that infrastructure that allows people to have that relationship. I think there are particular instances where your witnesses have felt things aren't working, we'd be very happy to look into those. But the general sense I get from the network and the industry is that Merlin is broadly a good thing.
And actually, sorry, if I just add, not wishing to make policy by anecdote, but I've done 2 round tables in recent weeks with the voluntary community sector, one down in the southwest, one organised by the NCVO, and actually neither fora has Merlin cropped up as an issue.
Okay. Teresa, I think you've got the rest.
Right.
Okay.
Sorry. Just wanted to talk a little bit about the work programme data. It was some sort of 17 months before we received any. It was November 2012. Was there a reason for that delay?
First of all, I think what we need to do when we publish data is make sure we've got a reasonable picture. And I don't mean that by a good picture, but actually just a proper representation, and there is a requirement for validation. And of course, someone joining the scheme, the vast majority of joining the scheme wouldn't be able to qualify for a job outcome until at least 6 months have elapsed. So doing it much earlier wouldn't have...
But 17 months is a long time.
No, absolutely. But and I think that there was some discussion about it. The publication date was set before I arrived in the department. We're now moving to publication on a 6-monthly basis. The next set of results will be published on the 28th of May. And I think it's right there should be timely data on this.
You said earlier that you're awash with evaluation, and you also mentioned that you get management information. Is there no information there that would be easily shared, that would help? The reason I ask is because 6-monthly reporting, given the size and the importance of this programme, might be too infrequent. Some of the evidence that we've heard is that people within the supply chain believe that more transparency of data would help with good practice sharing, and it would help them in innovation, because contrary to what you've said, Ms. Sweeney, is that some of the subprimes have said that they haven't seen very much new in the work programme. Everything is the same old stuff that they've seen before, and what they're asking for is more information, so that they actually, when there is innovation, it can be spread. So
I think there's 2 things. In terms of qualitative evaluation, that's published, and there's a regular cycle. There seems to be lots of different evaluations being published over time. On the performance of information, I think that primes are able and should share data within a supply chain on outcomes, and I know that I think most providers do that. Some actually enable their subcontractors to access that data on almost a daily basis. So that provides a sort of spur there. And of course, and primes do organise opportunities in which they can share data and experiences within their supply chain. I think I share your view about the frequency of publication of data. I would like to move to a much more regular publication of data. We do need to make sure that it's properly validated and verified. There's some board statistical checks that need to go through that, but I want to see more data published on a more timely basis.
So would you support the publication of data for outcomes below prime contractor level?
Well, I think that certainly I think within the supply chains that happens already, or should happen already.
But what a prime might say is, if there is somebody out there who's doing fantastic stuff, they want to be able to contract with that person in that organisation as well. Because if they don't know, if it's all kept just within that supply chain, does it not help in business to know exactly what's working and what's not?
I think, Mr. Pearce, one of the things that struck me about this, and I know you would have had a flavour from the evidence you got, is this is a pretty incestuous industry. They know each other very well. And I think that they all seem to work for each other or contracted with each other before. So I think they know what's happening. But that's one of the reasons for setting up the best practice group, is help promote that sharing of what is good practice and getting it out there. And absolutely for it not to be the preserve of the primes, but to get it out more broadly.
So one of the other points that was raised is if the work programme is going to succeed, people need to believe in it. People need to think that it's worth engaging with. So if information could be given outside of the supply chain, to say local authorities, MPs, local opinion formers, that would be a good way of raising the profile of where there is good practice. But at the moment they feel constricted by the way that the data is collected and published.
I mean, I think the two points. First of all, where something's part of national statistics, it can't be shared until it's published. And that's the same rules that govern a whole host of national statistics that are produced. I do think, though, I've seen two really good examples of primes engaging with their local members of parliament and local partners. I've seen in Hampshire, where A4E actually have a very good and effective way of engaging with MPs, not necessarily sharing performance data as such, but actually talking about the type of people they help, the people they work with, some success stories, talking about innovation. And I know that in the Southwest, I can't remember which provider it is, one of them I know wrote to MPs in the Southwest, as Steve Webb gave me a copy of the letter he'd got from the Prime. So I think there are ways in which Primes and subcontractors can engage with their local communities without having to breach national statistics rules. And actually, I would say I would encourage them to do that. Sometimes I think the work they do is one of the best kept secrets.
I visited my local work provider and also engaged with them as an employer, and that wasn't a wholly satisfactory experience, I have to say. But I think that was down to one particular person there rather than the whole organisation. The voice that seems to be missing in all of this is the individual who's on the work programme. Would you not want to actually systematically survey people, when they're on the work programme, to see how they're... Because the people you described earlier quite passionately described people who are really far away from the workplace, who've been just dumped and left. Confidence is a really important issue for them, and it needs to be a really personal service. So we need to know what's working and what's not, because those of us who've been in work for a long time, it's hard to imagine what that must be like. So surely having a systematic survey of satisfaction levels of people who are on the work programme would be a good way to find what for them is working.
Well, I think that's why, and I think Julia touched on it earlier on, I've certainly seen it in practice when I've been out and about meeting providers. But there's a lot of work providers do to establish the views of people using their service. A lot of interest in what delivers really good outcomes, a lot of interest in actually customer experience, and the quality of the interaction between advisors and claimants is there and is looked at carefully by providers. And of course, there are routes where someone is unhappy, to raise a complaint about their service. But I think the best test is whether people get into work or not.
Well, that's the outcome we all want.
Yeah.
But, just moving on to the role of Job Centre Plus.
Can I stop you there, because I'd forgotten I'd given them to Graham.
Oh,
I'm
happy to share.
Right, well, let Graham start, and we'll see if this is our last group of questions.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you, Chair. There's some evidence that officials within DWP are hostile between the working relationship with Job Centre Plus and work programme providers. We've been told that Job Centre Plus sometimes fails to pass on basic information such as homelessness, telephone numbers and the like. What can be done to improve that basic form of communication?
Well, I think that the relationship between Job Centre Plus and the work programme is really important, and we touched earlier on about the post-work programme returners, and I think it's interesting when I talk to Job Centre Plus staff, they now see the merits of a very strong relationship with work programme providers, and I think that's helping actually provide a real incentive to improve that relationship. Neil Kilding, who became the Director of Work Services towards the end of last year, has taken this on as a priority and is set out a series of measures that we should be taking to improve the quality of that relationship. Warm handovers, if that's something the work programme providers are looking for. I think about co-signing, co-location. So I think there's a real emphasis on raising the quality of the relationship between Job Centre Plus and the work programme providers. And certainly the conversation I have with providers would suggest that certainly at a district level, there are good relationships in place. I think that we need to do a bit more in local offices to raise the quality of that relationship and the consistency of that relationship as well.
The key ingredient to this, for this to work, is the engagement with good quality employers, and there's evidence to say that employers are not aware of the scheme, or in many cases that there's an unwillingness to engage. Organisations such as Transport for London do a fantastic scheme because they can plan for the future in terms of recruitment. Is it possible for the department to look into engaging such as organisations as Transport for London to get more people like them to work closer with Job Centre Plus? And talking personally, I did a jobs fair and I'm currently working with Job Centre Plus in Runcorn and Northwich. They're a very easy organisation in my experience to work with. I think the key thing is getting employers to engage with Job Centre Plus. Is there more that can be done about that?
Well, I think the issue of engagement between, let's look at the work programme and employers first, and then move on to Job Centre Plus. I think is a challenge. I think that different work programme providers have different approaches. So some will focus predominantly on SMEs rather than larger employers. Some employers actually, particularly I think big employers with a national recruitment model, find it difficult to engage with the work programme. Some of the work programme providers themselves actually are working on this and finding running to a common sales force or a common point of contact between the work programme and large national employers to increase their engagement. So I think there's more we can do on that. The CBI are very supportive of the work programme and are continually seeking ways in which we can strengthen that relationship between the work programme and large employers. And sometimes actually work programme providers find large employers quite difficult to work their way through. Who's responsible for recruitment at your shop? Well, I don't know. I think it's someone in London or someone here. And, so I think there's a two-way process there about improving engagement. I think on Job Centre Plus, one of the things I'm keen to do, and Neil Cooling, the director, is keen to do, is actually improve the quality of our engagement with Job Centre Plus and employers. We've got an excellent National Employer Service team that manages 200 accounts. I opened a Premier Inn last week in Waterloo. That recruited 1,100 people. A very close relationship with Job Centre Plus, and identifying the right people to work for that business. There's some really success stories there. What I'm keen to do is make sure every employer has a Premier Inn level of service. And I think we're taking steps to raise that quality of engagement. But like you, Graham, Mr. Evans, I think there's some excellent examples of really good engagement in Job Centre Plus and employers, and people forget, I think, what Job Centre Plus can offer. And of course, before Christmas, we launched Universal Job Match. 2 million people are registered with the Universal Job Match with their CVs on their background, their experience, their skills, ready to be matched with good vacancies.
You mentioned CBI. At a local level, the local Chamber of Commerce, I find, I think it'd be common sense for the local Chamber of Commerce to work with the local Job Centre Plus, but those two organisations are, as far as I'm concerned, respected within the community, and marrying those two together, working close together, may be one way of helping things along.
Absolutely, and we have a really good relationship with the British Chamber of Commerce and local chambers through. We have some very good partnership managers in place whose role is to build links with local employers. The British Chamber of Commerce have very helpfully promoted schemes like the youth contract, wage incentive, work programme in their publications. So we're also we've signed a series of memorandums of understanding with trade associations. We did a fantastic the IGD did a fantastic Feeding Britain's Future event last year, giving young people the opportunity to work in the food business, and partly as a consequence of the desire on their side, supported by Job Centre Plus, to a national and local level, to identify young people to take part in that scheme. So it's a multi-channel engagement, and I'd love to get to as many employers as possible and really spread the good news about what Job Centre Plus can do.
I've got Teresa and then Nigel.
Just about the issue about employers and engaging employers is really key. And small employers, not just small employers, but particularly small employers, taking on anybody is a risk. And they see it as a risk. And taking on somebody with complex needs, or has been very far away from the workplace, or maybe previously had an alcohol problem, that's a bigger risk. And I'd just like to ask you, as the Minister, you said to me once before you can't be responsible for what the media writes, but as as the Minister, you can be responsible for how your department presents facts. And I would just ask you to bear that in mind when negative stories come out in the press that come from the department about people who've been on benefit for a long time. It actually increases the discrimination against that person getting a job because the employer reads the paper too. And I just think it's very hard for people who have had problems and are trying to overcome them to get over that hurdle. And it's just, you said to me once before, you're not responsible for what's written in the paper, and I accept that. But you are responsible for how your department sometimes presents, spins information. And on your watch, I don't believe that's happened, but it did happen previously. So I would just ask you, please, to bear that in mind.
No, and actually, I would say, Ms. Pierce, is one of the things that we're very keen to do as a department is to get some really good news stories out there about people who've got into work, who face challenging circumstances. Because I think it's incentivises, it motivates people. You know, the fact that if you can read a story about someone who's perhaps been out of work for 10 years getting a job, you think, well, why can't I do that? And you know, the press team department spend a lot of time getting stories into our local papers about good news and using case studies. And you know, I'm very keen that work programme providers and Jobs Plus find good examples where someone's overcome some quite tough circumstances to get into work. Because I think that can be very motivating. I think I would just on the issue.
I was about to say, if you can get good news stories in the
yeah,
you might as well tell us.
I do. Our finest minds are working on it, but it actually does work. You know, and we have got, and I think actually local newspapers are much better at this than national newspapers. But just on the point of employers, the Federation of Small Business make the point to me frequently that actually smaller employers can be much better at accommodating people with more complex needs. They're less likely to have a rigid recruitment process that weeds people out. They're likely to be more flexible, and they'll take a view on circumstances. I was talking to on the roundtables last week to NACRO, who are trying to get employers to think very carefully about whether they have a box on forms asking for a CLB check. Does your business actually need to have a CLB check when someone has been employed in it? And really pushing that challenge, because actually some of those ways they use to weed people out actually act as a real barrier to people from quite challenging circumstances getting into work. I went to visit Freshfields, a law firm, a few weeks ago, looking at a project they were running with the Business Action on Homelessness. I started to realise a number of people on that programme, that room, were ex-offenders. And I asked Freshfields about, you're a big law firm, you're taking these people on, and their argument was, if we can do it, everybody else can do it. And so I think it's about positive stories, not just about employees, but also about employers who are prepared to take a risk and take somebody on.
I look forward to more positive stories about strivers.
And we took some very good evidence from Timpsons and their ex-offenders. It was absolutely excellent.
Chairman, can I say the press, the good news that Timpson were doing in prisons, the press went, Timpson teaches prisoners to cut keys in prison. And so the press will never give you anything.
Yes, Nigel.
Minister, well, I've worked quite closely with A4E, one of the providers in the East Midlands who have an operation in my constituency. The other provider in the Midlands, actually the nearest one is 10-15 miles away. I think it's interesting that it seems much harder to get them to work with local employers, more spread out, perhaps away from where their location is. Is that something that you've seen as a general experience, that if there's a local branch, it's easier for them to work with employers, and the further away employers are from the provider, perhaps the harder that is?
Yeah, I think sometimes that's the case. And I don't know if there's any statistical evidence to back it up, but I think one of the things I would say is, for a number of people who are out of work, travelling to an employer can be an issue. And it may be easier to get to work if the job is a mile down the road rather than 10 miles down the road. So sometimes it's a response to circumstances and the ability or willingness of job seekers to travel. And also what travel arrangements are in place. And I've seen some we were talking about joint working earlier on and cooperation. I think I'm right in saying that Amazon have a big warehouse in the West Midlands. Providers and JCP and Amazon work together to provide the transport to get people to work. That's a really good example of the partnership working. in practice. But I think sometimes providers do find jobs that are convenient for job seekers.
One issue I have locally is I have a proposed new supermarket turning up, which is, you can imagine, a new Morrison's in a market town isn't wonderfully popular. But one idea I put to them was, if you promised to take, I don't know, 20% of the new employees from local long-term unemployed people, perhaps working with the work programme provider, that might be a way of being more socially useful to the area. Sadly, they've not bothered to reply to me on that. But do you actually think there is a role working with other departments to say whether there are big new developments, actually we should be trying to link in planning conditions and trying to recruit the long-term unemployed? That's part of that programme.
Absolutely, and I think that there's a lot of focus on this. Developers can meet their Section 106 obligations through recruitment. I had a very good session with Land Securities, who seem to be redeveloping the whole of Victoria Street. They have actually said, as part of their requirements on their subcontractors, you must recruit people from the local labour market and train them up. And particularly those being long-term unemployed, they work with the homelessness projects like the Passage as well. So I think people can make that contribution. The other thing I'd say on Morrison's, last week I was in Gloucester and I met Morrison's. They're building a new supermarket in the Railway Triangle, and Richard Graham, the MP for Gloucester, will tell you all about this. They are committed to taking people on from the local community. I think actually a number of supermarket chains, Tesco's are doing that for regeneration stores that they're opening. There's a lot of interest, I think, and employers often, I think now increasingly, are seeing themselves as having an obligation to the community that they serve. And if they recruit people from the local community, then local people will come and shop with them as well. So I think what we need to do is make sure we get the long-term unemployed and youth unemployed into those opportunities too.
There's nothing new about that, and neither is it necessarily something that has to be tied to the work programme. Because, one of the things we heard about yesterday was the Wembley Hub, which was the result of Section 106, and it was a partnership between, in fact, JCP mainly, because it predated the work programme. They had brought in work programme providers as well, and the local council. So this is something, yes, it was a Section 106, yes, funding had gone into it. And councils have been doing this, up and down the country, long before the work programme was
I'm not saying, Ms. Gilmore, that it's anywhere new or revolutionary. I'm saying it's happening. And I do actually think that more employers are interested in this. And I think often Section 106 agreements, council saw as an opportunity for more infrastructure. And now skills training is an opportunity there, which I think is a good thing to be celebrated.
Are there still sometimes some obstacles raised that you can't do that for procurement reasons? Something you sometimes hear, people say, oh, but we can't,
The biggest problem is often that they put certain restrictions on the qualities and qualifications they're looking, which rules out the local unemployed people. And that can sometimes happen.
But I think, Damon, Land Securities is a very good model of someone who's actually overcome that quite happily, and are asking their suppliers, their build contractors, to recruit people with no skills and train them up, which I think is a really positive example for developers to follow. So I think it can be done with a will.
I think Nigel's got one more question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Minister, this whole programme has been quite a radical change with the payment by results and things. If you what are we, nearly 2 years in, are you now thinking, is there anything you wish you'd done differently or added or wish you could change as part of this programme that would make it more effective, especially when other government departments have been looking at similar structured programmes?
I've looked at this quite carefully, in the few months since I took on this role, and recognising the interest in payment by results across government. I think actually it is a very bold and imaginative scheme. I think there's some really good features in there. I've been when I've talked to other ministers elsewhere in other governments, not just in the UK, and when I've met work programme providers in Australia and my opposite numbers in Australia, I sort of come back actually feeling sort of reassured that we have made the right decisions, we got the right design. I think that going back to Ms. Pearce's comment, I do wish we had more data. And from the outset, and that's something we're tackling now. But I think one of the things that came out from Australia, that I'm not sure I want to go down this route of being dictatorial, but they insisted on the same IT system for every provider to collect data, and I think the better and more efficient way of doing this. But I'm very keen that we use data to talk about the benefits of the scheme, but also to enable us to manage the scheme and actually drive through continued performance improvements.
But you aren't thinking there should have been more providers in each area, or we should have more competition or less competition?
I think actually one of the things that's really struck me is that it has brought new people into the market. Ingeus, Maximus, G4S, Serco. There are people at the supply chains who are new to welfare to work programs in the UK. I think there's always you'll always see different models will have different strengths and weaknesses. We've moved from a situation where the department managed hundreds, I think nearly 500 contracts directly, to now moving to managing effectively 40 contracts. I think that enables us to give the focus on driving up performance in a way perhaps we weren't able to do so before.
Just for clarity, really, in relation to the statement I made of the oral evidence was given by some of the providers around the work capability assessment. In response to a question about seeing any improvements in work capability assessment, the particular provider said and gave the example, we had a client who was terminally ill with cancer, referred to us, whose life expectancy was shorter than the work-ready prognosis. So I just wanted to clarify, and that's from the transcript of the oral evidence. So there's still improvement.
Yeah, but certainly someone with terminal cancer should be referred pretty much automatically to support groups. I'm surprised that and disappointed that they were in the work-related activity group.
I think that was the point, and there was no mechanism to refer them back. Clearly they weren't there, and if they don't turn up, they get sanctioned. So
it's a good point about the referral mechanism.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. It's been a long session, but I think a very useful one. You've obviously clearly settled into your job over the months since we've seen you last, so thank you very much. We'll now use the evidence that we've received to write our report, I think, over the Easter recess, and we'll be publishing sometime after that. So thank you again, and that's to bring the meeting to a close. Order.
Thank you very much.